Hey everyone, welcome back to the Miss Education Podcast. I'm your host, Victoria, and this is the podcast where we talk all things education, meaning schools, school systems, teaching, communities, and a place where we get to dissect challenges, futuristic ideas, and other social justice matters. Today, we're talking about why do people think social and emotional learning is so controversial? I'm going to introduce my guest. His name is Asher Miller. He is on the policy team at the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, which is titled CASEL. He believes deeply in the power of public policy, serving to improve the experiences of students, educators, and families. A Chicagoland native, he has a particular passion for SEL and restorative justice. He recently earned a master's in education policy and analysis from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I met him. Prior to joining CASEL, Asher worked with various nonprofits to implement and foster SEL and restorative practices in several Chicago public schools. Asher loves sports and engaging in political discussions, plays saxophone and piano, and his favorite foods are pickles and gyros. So welcome, Asher, to the podcast.
Thank you, Victoria. And it is really an honor to be here, and it feels so special. And, I'm just thinking about all the many nights spent at hanging out with you at Harvard over ice cream and popcorn and many snacks, having discussions just like the one we're about to have. So it's fun to have it in this particular way, and just grateful to be here. Want to just really quickly say that my views, anything I say today, are my own and not the views of CASEL. So now I'll be ready to say some really controversial things now that I got that out of the way.
And really, when Asher says controversial, he doesn't really mean controversial, but that's his opinion.
Sure.
You can be the judge, right? Listeners can be the judge. They can let me know.
Absolutely.
So today we're talking about social and emotional learning. And I wanted to just start with the basics of what is social and emotional learning, because you work at this organization. Tell us, what's the definition in your experience of social and emotional learning?
Sure. So social and emotional learning is a term that has a definition that's proliferated into many definitions over the years. To be honest, it's one of the issues in the field generally, not that makes it controversial so much, but is just getting that definition down and making sure that people have a common understanding of what it is and what it's not. So the way that CASEL, which is the field leader in SEL, defines it is as a process through which young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for each other, for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. So that's a lot. To boil that down into the way that I think about it, a little more, maybe more in layman's terms than that, is that it's the ways in which do we develop the life skills that we need to succeed in the classroom and beyond, the things that are foundational to learning and to career or college or everything beyond. These are things, again, like empathy, like relationship skills, like self-awareness, the ability to manage yourself. It's anything that, when you think about the things that made you successful in school, it's probably wrapped up in social and emotional learning or social and emotional skills in some form. So with that in mind, I also thought it'd be fun, Victoria, if it's okay with you, to model for your audience, one of the kind of signature practices of SEL, which is inclusive welcome, warm welcome, and icebreaker. These are things that people are really familiar with. So I thought, if it's okay with you, I'll kick it back to you and ask just a really simple question to start this off: of what is a social or emotional skill that you're planning on bringing to the podcast today?
Oh, thank you for that question. And
You're welcome.
Warm. You said it's called a soft opening, a warm opening?
It's got a million names, to be honest,
Okay.
But warm welcome, we just changed at CASEL. We started calling it an inclusive welcome recently. Okay. So, an icebreaker, okay. warm welcome is kind of my favorite version of it.
Okay. Warm welcome. I think for this podcast today, not that we have very differing views, but I don't know as much as you do. So I'm hoping to bring a space of respect and curiosity.
That's great. Thank you for that. I think, and I'm planning to bring a listening ear as well, and a sense of empathy, and also just excited to bring relationship skills back into this conversation as well, and just excited to be here with a friend. So excited to chat more.
Awesome. Okay. And within SEL, recently we're seeing a lot of controversy in the media, in the news, and with legislation, right? And I think that some things that I've heard or that I've read in articles is that people see social and emotional learning as a distraction from real learning. And I think people might be confused on when it's taught, how it's taught. Is it a class? Is it infused? What does a school even look like without social and emotional learning? And I think people kind of conflate it as something that's not academics. What do you think? Where are these myths coming from? And can we debunk some of these myths?
Yes. So in terms of where these things are coming from, and um, there are, well, first of all, let me just state, do the probably thing that communications people will, if they're listening, will be upset by. I'm going to state a couple more myths that are out there. Even to your point, it's out there that this is a distraction from academics, which is, we'll get into why these are not true, but there's a belief that it's therapy and that we're therapizing children, and that we're asking teachers to become counselors and to be psychologists in the classroom. Also not true. Um, there's a belief that we're indoctrinating children with a specific political agenda, which is perhaps the most far fetched of all, I would argue. And then there's this also then argue that it's kind of a one size fits all for the whole country. So these are there's lots of myths out there, and happy to jump into why and how any of these are what about these are false. But I think that in terms of the origin of this a little bit, part of what's going on here is SEL has gotten wrapped up in a broader culture war that's going on in the country, in the U.S. right now in particular. And this is something that I'm sure your listeners are aware of, but there's all this pushback on things like critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Just the other day, there was a congressional hearing about DEI and saying all sorts of wild things about it. And there's kind of this is something that in particular conservatives are throwing out there and saying that it's just an alphabet soup of 3-letter words, and this is just how progressives and liberals are hiding their political agenda and things like that. So a lot of it kind of comes from that, and there's kind of these talking points that are getting put out there that are being proliferated across the country by various, I would call them vocal minorities, typically white conservative suburbanites who are saying things about SEL that are just untrue. We've heard all sorts of everything from SEL promotes abortions to SEL is turning our kids gay. Which, if that were the case, I would say, great, too bad, good for you. but we also know that that's not really what's going on. So there's a lot of, we can chat more about this later. There's a lot of kind of interesting history behind how we got there, but this is essentially a political agenda to, to try and control what's going on in public education. I also think there's a lot going on here to try and harm public education and make it something that forces people out of the public education system, convince parents that what their kids are getting is not what they actually think they're getting and not what they need, force them into the private system. So there's kind of a bigger end game here that probably is a much larger thing going on. But this is something that conservatives have latched onto and tried to say that it's bad. There are some fair criticisms of SEL, to be sure, but I think that's a bit of how where this has come from.
Mm-hmm. And you said that there's some fair criticisms. What do you think are the fair criticisms?
Sure. I think some fair criticisms. So if you kind of back up a little bit into the late, social and emotional learning is a term that was coined in about 30 years ago now, more or less. Although if you go back even further, this is something that really was, it really has its origins in the 1960s and 70s from scholars at Yale University, by slightly different terms, including emotional intelligence and other things of that nature. But relatively more recently, in the 2010s, mid to late 2010s, there was a lot of criticism, and there's continued to be, of the ways in which SEL does not meet the needs of all students. That it's something that is When you look at, if you Google CASEL wheel, you'll see what I'm talking about. But if you look at the 5 core competencies that some of which I mentioned earlier: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision making, the ways in which those are being applied are often very white and often very much normed in white culture. And there was a sense that this is perhaps not always being customized or being used in a way that addresses the needs of students who are typically have been historically marginalized. And I think that criticism is has roots in being fair. I think if it's applied with a blanket approach without understanding the context of your children, with lessons that are not applying to your kids. If you're applying let me put it this way: if you're doing SEL in Chicago public schools the same way that you're doing it in Montana in a rural school district, you're probably missing the point. That's not the intention of SEL, but that is part of the application of it.
Right.
So there's some of that I think is fair, and scholars like Dina Simmons has even gone as far as to say that when it's done without nuance, SEL risks turning into white supremacy with a hug, which is probably the strongest criticism I've ever heard of it, and the most intense.
Right.
I think that's very strong. But that's one criticism, for example, that I think is fair. So I'll pause there, but I think that's one that is a relatively fair criticism that the field has responded to. But that's one that's out there.
Right. Thank you. And I think that's kind of speaking to your other myth, that the idea that there's a one size fits all would be the myth, right? Because like you're saying, if the field is responding, then there is that nuance, or there is that specific culturally or context relevant social emotional learning, or even board specific, right? Specific communities need to have their own strategies.
Sorry.
And then you also mentioned that one of the myths is that it's a specific political agenda. So I'm interested in, you said that is it mostly, or is it 100% of the pushback and the bills filed is by a specific political leaning?
Political party. Sure. Yeah, it is. I would say it's 99.9% are coming from Republicans. So this is something that I've looked at really closely and pay very close attention to. The bills that are, explicitly seeking to ban, and this is something that is out there. There's something like 30 to 40 bills just in the last 2 years at the state level in different states across the U.S. that are seeking to ban social and emotional learning. And I'd say I cannot think of one that's come from a Democrat. So they're pretty much exclusively coming from Republicans in the state legislatures across the country, as well as the United States federal, and Congress. So it's something that has been driven by that. There's a scholar, I would put scholar in quotes, but named Chris Rufo, who's really started this in 2020, 2021, and started to try and, this is someone who's, just to give you an idea of where he stands politically, this is someone who's been floated as a potential Secretary of Education candidate for Donald Trump should he get reelected. So, that's the kind of person who's behind a lot of this, who's kind of started some of this, who's tried to tie social emotional learning to the debate around gender and sexuality in the classroom, to CRT in the classroom. This idea that's out there that critical race theory is being taught to kindergartners, which we know is not true, but and has tried to kind of just link these ideologies together. And you hear these talking points reiterate, these parroted in places all the way from Congress to school board meetings, all over the country, that SEL is a Trojan horse for critical race theory and gender ideology and Marxism and things like that. So that's all part of the origin of it, and it's very, very frequently coming from the far right and Republicans, which is disturbing, especially because this is something that is, to be honest, it's bipartisan. Like, there's nothing, when you really break it down, it's hard to imagine talking to a parent, no matter what political leaning, and saying, do you want your kid to be an empathetic person, to be able to work in teams, to be able to build relationships, healthy relationships? and you expect that they're going to say no. So it's something that there's a perception versus reality thing going on here that's really difficult, and it's gotten very convoluted. So
yeah, that's interesting because I don't know how it was where you were growing up in Chicago, but or in the wow, I almost forgot what state Chicago is. I was like, that state that's called Illinois.
You've been in Canada too long,
Yeah,
Victoria.
too long. In Illinois, I don't know if it's the same as where I'm from, which is Ontario, that on our report cards for grades for all of elementary and secondary school, we have learning skills on the report card, and teachers have to comment on the learning skills. And I think at this point, I almost forgot what they are, but responsibility, cooperation, self like management, working with others, like things like that are on the report card, and they have to report to parents about it. Do they have the same thing in Illinois and across the state? And is that also being challenged, or what is happening with the report cards or the reportings?
It's a great question. I don't think that when I was growing up that was something in Illinois. However, I can say that for my very adorable nephew Sammy, that I've seen his little 2.5-year-old report cards in quotation marks, which do incorporate exactly what you're saying. I think they even call it SEL skills or something like that on his particular report card. And then they're talking, helping, explaining to his parents how he's developing or not, or where he has areas of growth and needs to work on these things. So yes, that is something that I think is being incorporated into things like that. And I should just clarify, you could correct me if I'm wrong. It's not necessarily something that like goes into your GPA or something like that. This is more so to help, it's to help your growth and development. And this is another thing, we talked about, just to loop back to the question of how this is supposedly a distraction from academics. When we think about why that's on a report card, the whole point of that, it's not just for fun. I mean, it's nice to know, and I'm sure parents love seeing and hearing that their little kid is good at making friends, and that's really cute. It is like lovely. But the point of it, like when we boil it down, and this has taken me some time to come around to, because I do believe that inherently in itself, SEL has its value just on its own. And the point of public education, is to help students grow academically and grow academic skills and learn. And learn academic things is a big part of it, like math and learning how to read, right? So that you can go out and get a job and be part of the workforce. And now I sound like a Republican, but you get the idea. And the point of it, of being a report card, is so that you can help a student grow those skills, which we know are in service of improving academics. So that's where the research is strong.
Right.
We know that SEL, these skills that we're referring to that were on your report card as a kid and are on Sammy's report card now, actually help you grow academically.
Right.
And there's brain science behind that. There's been study after study and meta-analysis after meta-analysis for 30 years now showing that link. I will say there is a criticism that we don't know, back to the question of one size fits all and a fair criticism. There is a criticism of the research that it hasn't been strong enough in saying, how does SEL work and for whom exactly? It's been more generalized as a whole for the whole country, broadly. We don't necessarily know enough about how well it works for students with disabilities, for Black and brown students versus for white students. So the breakdown of that information and the specificity is an area where the field is recognizing a gap and is starting to address. And it's something that we can talk more later about, so it's something that I'm excited about. But that is a fair criticism and something that we need to learn more about. But on a broad spectrum, we know that it's not a distraction from academics. If anything, you need these skills to be able to succeed. Again, if you think about sitting in a math class and working collaboratively with your teammates, on a problem, and you're disagreeing, and you have to figure out how to disagree without being disagreeable, which is something, or you need to figure out how to read a passage and understand the identity and the emotions that a character might be feeling, and how you might connect to those feelings. These are like critical thinking skills that are they're not separate from academics. They are essential. It's the idea that you can bifurcate them is almost so far-fetched that it's hard to argue against. But so that was a long answer to your question about report cards, but relevant, I think.
Yeah, no, thank you. And that reminded me of two things. One is that when I was speaking with Jamin, Chris Jamin, I was speaking with him on a different podcast episode about teaching and moving into consulting, but he mentioned that he used to be a music educator. And then in that episode, he was talking about the fact that his music classes kind of turned into social skills in a way, because he was saying that, the students are working together to make a band. Maybe they have to share instruments. Maybe they have to decide what song do we want to play. And he's like, it actually turned into a social skills class where I was teaching them how to cooperate with others. What do you do when you don't get exactly what you want, or you don't get the instrument you want, or you have to compromise with people on when are we going to rehearse, when is our final performance going to be, things like that you wouldn't necessarily think, oh, music class is going to have all these skills. But he's like, no, it really did have these social emotional, he didn't use those words, but it is SEL skills that he was teaching them in the end. So I think that was really cool. And another part that I was interested in is that with the kind of report cards and the reporting structures, I mean, it's interesting that you didn't have that structure on your report card growing up, but it seems to be something that's widely infused in a lot of different reporting. And like you said, I'm sure parents from any political leaning would want their kids to, be able to collaborate with others, be able to time manage and things like that. I think there's a part of the social and emotional skills or learning that feels like they're only being taught to empathize with people who have very different values than them, and maybe that's the separation, right? Because if they're taught have empathy for others, have empathy for people who are queer, who are values or things that you don't agree with, then that's maybe where there's a pushback more than can your child time manage. I feel like you said, they wouldn't really have a pushback for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that's a really good point. That part of what's going on here, I'll just call it what I think it is there's some there's more than just race that you just mentioned, obviously, but I think there's a lot of white fragilities wrapped up in this, right? There's a sense that, if you're accepting and acknowledging and celebrating or lifting up or any of those things, someone who's different from you, then you're like, throwing away your own identity,
right,
or that yours is being lessened or something like that.
right.
So, I mean, that's not my area of expertise, but I do think that, and you can see that. So you can, when when we talk about what this pushback looks like, we're seeing, one of the examples of it, of course, is testimonies at school board meetings, where this is where you get all sorts of wild clips of people saying wild things, and one of the things that you hear is that kind of comment around like social, people are saying social and emotional learning is like I said, is turning my kid into this and that, and what they're really saying is I don't understand. What I hear is I don't understand what other people are. I don't understand why other people are what they are, and I'm afraid of it, right? It's like so, which of course, if those people had better social emotional learning, education growing up, they probably would have a better sense of empathy and understanding and being willing to handle that. But that's a little beside the point. Unfortunately, at this point, it's probably too late for them, sadly. But but I think that's I think it's a really astute point, that is something that we're seeing, and in these different legislation, in these different pieces of legislation across the country, sometimes you see echoes of that as well. Again, I mentioned that often wrapped up in the same bill, we're seeing the mention of all these different things of trying to both ban gender ideology and social and emotional learning, or ban critical race theory, and DEI and social and emotional learning. So there's certainly a lumping together of all these things that I think conservatives are just seeing and saying, I don't know what's going on there. I'm afraid I don't want my kid to be. I don't know. I think they just don't understand what's going on and are worried about it. And I know that probably makes me sound very unempathetic to those folks, but I think it's a lot of what's going on.
Right. So you're noticing that it's getting wrapped up in other, what they see as like, jargon, buzzwords, that's too quote unquote liberal. And then it's just like CRT, DEI, SEL, like all together, LGBTQS, all together. And they just think we're going to put all of those acronyms away, right, into the legislation.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of.
I mean, I think I'm sorry.
Oh, no, keep going.
No, yeah, I mean, there's literally a document out there that we've seen that I think it's literally refers to all these things as alphabet soup and says these are the things that you should be looking for to ban in your school districts.
Right. Right.
Um, I had a conversation with a conservative recently who said anything with a three letter acronym is on our chopping block right now. So
Right.
which makes it sound so simplistic and it's hard to understand, but it's created a bizarre kind of blowback to anything that is wrapped up in this. So
Right. Right. Which is
for sure, which I should mention. Oh, sorry, which I should mention also is I think part of the resistance. I know we'll talk more about this later, but part of the resistance to the pushback has been to figure out ways to do SEL without calling it SEL, and that's something that you know we don't. I think it's fine. It's not ideal because the research is specific to SEL. The research that I referenced that points to all the academic gains, and there's also a return on investment. It's like $11 for every dollar spent on SEL. Return on investment in the long. That's all about SEL specifically. However, if you're doing these things and you're teaching these skills and you're embedding them into academic content, like what you call it is secondary. So if that's what it takes to weather the storm, my opinion is that's it is what it is. That's understandable, and you have to do what you have to do. And I think that's a little different than some of these other areas. Like I think that the value of anyway, I'll leave it there for now with SEL, but
yeah.
But I think it's okay to do that.
Yeah, as well in DEI work to do DEI work without using DEI, right? Make your new role
Right.
whatever you want to title it, and then do DEI work, because people might agree with you if you're talking about, said person in the organization's feeling excluded for these reasons, and they might actually have empathy for that. And if you talk about strategies, how are we going to help? How are you going to help? Again, they might be on board. And the moment you say, hey, we're having a DEI consultant come in, it's like, whoa, why are we doing this? And there's all of a sudden pushback right around the abbreviation or acronym. So I want to talk about because you're talking about a lot of the pushback. So what are some other forms of pushback that you're seeing because you work in this organization? You mentioned that there was anti-SEL bills. What else are people doing to kind of fight against SEL? What are you seeing?
Yeah. So, and I do just want to also just to point out some of the ridiculousness of some of the bills. I just want to one of the things, just because it's an area where I spend a lot of time. And I should also state there's been something like 30 or 40. None of the really explicitly anti-SEL ones have passed, which is great. We've seen strong resistance to them. I want to point to one in particular that just happened recently in New Hampshire, not far from your border. But there's a bill out there that actually mimics an Oklahoma bill from last year that seeks to restrict and ban social and emotional learning and any training related to it. And I just wanted to tell you how they define social and emotional learning, and I won't use the whole thing because it's long, but they are essentially saying that you cannot engage in anything in schools that is involving or including but not limited to self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationships, and responsible decision-making. So those are the 5 core competencies. So that's referencing CASEL and
directly
what SEL is typically thought of. But then it goes further and says, and or social skills, emotions, feelings, metacognitive learning skills, grit, self-regulation, tenacity, perseverance, resilience, and or interpersonal resources. So which one is kind of nonsensical just grammatically, but also is just in terms of the things that you're trying to ban. You think about what kind of student you'd end up with at the end of the day, should you ban all those things somehow? I don't know how you would ban those things, but if you did, you'd end up with some sort of Autotron robot that feels nothing and sees nothing, and this is not my quote, but I just want to reiterate because I think it's relevant, and it's one of the things that I think is a little bit helpful. But there's no student who walks into a classroom without a heart or a brain. Like you cannot separate those two things. And so the idea that you can ban tenacity in a classroom is just bizarre to me and really offensive, and is so backwards. And also, just to call it what it is, and this is again just as a reminder, me saying these controversial things, not CASEL, but I think it's something that Republicans for so long have said personal liberty and freedom and individuality and all these things, and now we're saying no, this is exactly, you have to do this, this, and this, and not that. And if that's not restricting personal liberty, then I don't know what is. So, anywho, that is one of the key forms, is seeing these kind of ridiculous bills. Often the bills are kind of what we call marker bills, or excuse me, messaging bills, which are just, they're not really expected to go anywhere. They're just for the purpose of a candidate, or getting press out there that they're doing this, and they get to say to their constituents, look, I'm doing this. Still, it's concerning, and some of them do go places and could, there's a fear of a real danger of that. I should say, though, that particular bill was killed, and it was stopped in spectacular fashion, with thousands of people writing in opposition to it, 25 people showing up in person to testify against it, 19-1 defeat in the committee. So good news there. But your question was about other forms besides bills, besides legislation. So we've also seen district level restrictions, where some school districts have in response to this, have swept it under the rug, or said that you can't do SEL, or they've hid it, as I mentioned before, and called it something else. But we've seen that is one form of restriction, or is at the district level. We've also seen removal of web pages and state standards on SEL from different websites across the country. In places like Virginia had taken theirs down for some time. Iowa has removed any references to SEL from their webpage, which means that the resources that are out there for teachers to use are not publicly available for them. And then at the federal level, we've seen some really disturbing things, like in a trauma-informed practices grant, there's been an attempt to strike the word social and emotional learning from that bill in an amendment, which would essentially remove SEL or is attempting to remove SEL as a acceptable use of that grant, which luckily has not gone anywhere yet. And then there's just the bully pulpit, right? There's kind of people in Congress using their platform to speak out against SEL. The the ranking member of the Education Committee in the Senate just published a literacy report, which points to the idea that SEL is, as we mentioned before, it actually hurts reading and literacy outcomes for students. So that's another kind of pushback that we're seeing, is just is through reports and things of that nature. There was a conservative think tank at Stanford that published a similar report recently that pointed to all sorts of flaws in SEL. So lots of attacks through reports, legislation, district level, state level. It really kind of runs the gamut in terms of the ways that pushback are showing up.
Yeah, I'm interested to know, have you spoken directly to any of these people, any of the legislatures or the representatives, senators who have this position, or stakeholders who have that position, and what do they say? If you've spoken to them, I'm just curious.
Yeah, they typically are not wanting to talk with us so much, just because they know exactly who we are. However, that doesn't mean that we haven't done it. So we have. I think I referenced one of those conversations earlier in terms of the alphabet soup thing, and there's a what I will say about it is that I've heard things from that camp that are people saying things like, well, we don't actually disagree with social and emotional learning, or social and emotional skills are fine, you just have to call it something else, or we agree with what you're doing, it's just that there's some bad actors out there. And then they'll point to things like the fact that there's one-off stories, right? There's like stories, you've probably seen the same thing in the DEI space. Well, we know that DEI is being used to make white people hate themselves because we saw this video once where a white kid cried because, that kind of thing. So in SEL, we've seen examples that typically get brought up are things like, SEL is being used for things like purchasing therapy guinea pigs in the classroom, which, like, to me is like cute,
Right.
adorable, probably actually does help with all sorts of emotional regulation and like all that. However, it's not
Yes.
evidence based
Right.
necessarily. It's not like rooted in
Yeah.
rigorous, randomized
Yeah.
control trials and all that, Fair enough. However, it's a
Yeah.
one-off story. So they're pointing to that and saying, we're going to throw the baby out with the
Yeah.
bathwater. Sorry for the crude phrase. And just get rid of SEL entirely because one school district in Kansas used it for to buy a hamster. It's like, so that's one of the arguments is this kind of like bad actor argument. And what are you doing to stop the bad actors? And what are you going to do about
Right.
that? And all that kind of thing. So that's part of it. And then there's this kind of messaging perception thing where they actually, which makes me wonder, it makes me question the motives even more because, well, if you're agreeing with what we're doing generally, but you're wanting to throw it out, then what are you really
Yeah.
trying to do here? Again, I think there's a broader attempt to like devalue public education and destroy the public education system more broadly. That's my own view, um, that is those are some of the things that we've heard from those folks, I'd say.
Yeah, that's interesting because that reminds me of I was recently at a talk of Dr. Bettina Love. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so she wrote the book
Yep.
Punished for Dreaming, I think 2023, and then We Want to Do More Than Just Survive. I think that was in 2018 or 2019. And she was talking about how a lot of the pushback on
Yeah.
DEI or things in the classroom that are actually fighting for systemic justice is that, these one off stories, right? We don't like how I saw a grade one classroom where they did talk about critical race theory, right? Things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, also, the statistics, we know that most teachers in the States are white and most are women. So you're telling me that you're upset that white women specifically are talking about critical race theory? And it's like the math is just not mathing. You know what I mean? Like it's just not making sense. I'm like,
Sure.
who do you think is doing this work? Because if only 1% or 2% of teachers in the United States are black, who are these freedom fighters that you're getting mad at? Who are the people that you're even talking about? It's not even the people that you think you're attacking that you're attacking. It's mainly white women who are teachers anyways. And are they the ones who you're coming at? No, it's the one black teacher you saw in that one video who said, we need reparations. And they're like, we can't talk about this in schools. So I think there's always this kind of straw man argument of look at this one story.
Right.
And like you said, that woman who maybe she agreed with you, but she said, what are you doing to stop the bad actors? What is she really fighting for? She doesn't even know. Right. So
Right.
it's a little bit confusing
Right.
sometimes to me. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. No, I appreciate. I think that's a great. I think it's a really, it's an apt comparison. Also, just love Bettina Love.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
she's wonderful and just grateful for what she, everything she does. But yeah, I think that is, and again, in terms of the bad actors, I think the other thing there is, so when we talk about things that are kind of ironic to hear out of Republicans' mouths are local control is such a
Yeah.
strong. I mean, it's a thing that I think is pretty in the U.S. education system is pretty bipartisan to the idea of wanting to have local control over your own child's education and your own school district, your own school. And so again, I think if your school district is deciding to approve funds for a hamster, right. Should you, as a United States senator, be legislating against that small town's decision to do that? I mean, again, I think reasonable people will disagree about that, but I just want to point out the kind of the hypocrisy there of the irony and the hypocrisy of that. So it's just that's part. It's hard for me to get over it as someone who works at a research organization. I shouldn't say that, but as someone who's just follows politics and gets annoyed with Republicans, I will say that.
Right. And I think you mentioned previously about the history of these kind of conflations, and you talked about Chris Rufo and how he got involved with this kind of culture war. Is there any other kind of like the history of these? What is SEL and the origins that you wanted to speak on?
I think those are the key things. I think that the other part of it is that I think is I'd be remiss not to mention is the timing of this is somewhat interesting around the pandemic. So I think that the strong criticism from the far right started to bubble up around 2020, 2021. That's when we started to see it. And I just want to point out, again, in terms of broader culture war, the things that coincides with in terms of things like masking in schools and the murder of George Floyd and the protests that followed in the United States. It is, again, I think the context is, we don't often think about it at CAS, or we don't often talk about it externally a ton in the field, because I think we're focused on sticking to the science, pushing the research. But I think it's relevant for people to think about that, and what is going, just to ask yourself the question. I don't have an answer to it. You might have a better answer, Victoria, but what happened there that made people get so freaked out by the idea that we're teaching kids to be empathetic and to have agency and things of that nature. And this is another piece of it as well, is that of the history here, is that in response to the criticism in the 2010s from people like Dina Simmons that I mentioned, and other, I think Bettina Love had some similar criticism, actually, I want to say, although I have to double check on that. There was part of how the field of SEL responded to it was to say, okay, well, we need to be explicit then, because this is not the purpose. So part of what happened, and there's some incredible scholars who including people from CASEL, who started to develop something that's been referred to now as TSEL, which is transformative SEL. And transformative SEL, it focuses more explicitly on equity and inclusion and the ways in which you need to be culturally responsive in incorporating SEL into instruction, and considering the identities and your privilege and all. It says, it essentially said, this is something that we clearly need to say. We kind of hoped that SEL would do this on its own, I think, from the get-go, but it's not doing it. We recognize that, so we need to be more explicit. And that's part of what drove that. The push, that was in 2018, 2019, I think, I think right around 2019 when that kind of seminal piece was written, led by Dr. Rob Yeagers from CASEL. And shortly after, lo and behold, is when the pushback to SEL really started to kick up. And often, not always, but sometimes the attempts to ban social and emotional learning, I should say, are specifically calling out transformative SEL, not just SEL. So there is something there that makes people uncomfortable about, again,
the equity piece,
the equity of it all, if you will, right? That just disturbs people, and I think, I don't personally think this, but I think there's a belief that may have put a target on SEL's back. Yeah. Does that mean that it shouldn't have happened? Absolutely not. I think it's probably one of the best things that ever happened to the field, regardless of the pushback and all the hullabaloo that's come with it. But that is a key part of the history here as well, is to understand the ways in which TSEL has kind of has been part of this story.
Yeah, no, thank you for that kind of history on the TSEL. And that does remind me of, I mean, you said 2020, 2021, that things started to kind of rise up. Yeah. My personal hypothesis is that because the education system totally crashed in 2020 and people didn't know what to do, we didn't know how to do online learning, there was some evidence of learning loss. And there was evidence that teachers are burnt out, students are burnt out, mental health for sure went up, like mental health crises went up. Okay. So I think that people, when they're seeing 2021, 22, 23, they're looking for, how are we going to return to the classroom? How are we going to get back to learning? How are we going to bring students back up? But all they hear is DEI, critical race theory, social emotional learning, and they're like, where's the arithmetic, right? Like, where's the chemistry? Exactly. And I think that they feel like that's the reason that there's a setback. To me, I understand the criticism, but there's a larger setback. Like, I think that the pandemic just kind of exposed all of the ways education wasn't working, and that made a lot of the system fail and a lot of the test scores go down or whatever it is. But I think people see it as, clearly test scores have factually gone down from 2020 to now, and it must be that we keep hearing about these theoretical, educational theories or critical theory in general. And I don't think that they like how they hear those things, and they don't see test scores rising. If test scores were rising since the pandemic and they heard these things, I feel like there wouldn't be a lot to fall back on. But because test scores, education is kind of going down, it's a good argument for them to say, look, it's not working. Let's go back to basics.
That's right. And so yeah, I'm getting you just touched on another key
Mm-hmm.
criticism here, or another key
Okay.
talking point
Yeah.
against SEL that's used.
Back
Back
to
to
basics.
basics.
Yep.
That is this
Our
back to
premier
basics
used the
argument
same thing.
is
He said the
exactly.
same thing. He said, yeah, he said, let's
Is
get
that
back
right?
to basics. We're doing math and this and this. I don't know
Exactly.
what year. I think 2020 or 2021. And it was just kind of like
It's fascinating.
it was a weird time.
Right. I mean, yes, and it is weird. And I get into your point. Like, I do get it to some degree. You're right. I mean, when we look at all these test scores and all that, although you should and probably already have a podcast lined up about standardized testing and its problems there. However, it's the best measure we have of
Right.
academic blah blah blah. But when we look at them, yeah, it's a fact. Math and reading scores are at they're stalled at best, and they're
Yep.
going down at worst in terms of
Yep.
students' performance. So yes, the knee jerk reaction is to double down. Let's do more math, more reading, extra time, and all these things. And there's some evidence behind those things as well. However, uh, you cannot, again, just to bring it back to where we started, you cannot do these things if you are not able to
Right.
self-regulate. If you're not able to take a deep breath when you're frustrated, like when for this New Hampshire bill, for example, we had a 6-year-old girl testify. We didn't have her. She showed up to testify against this bill and explained how when she gets frustrated on the playground before she goes back in for math class, she does deep 5-finger breathing where she breathes in as she goes up and breathes out as she goes down. And she demonstrated this for the committee, which was an incredible scene, and they gave her a standing ovation and all that. However, again, is that 6-year-old girl going to be able to really be effective in her learning if she's not able to, to take a moment to breathe, to stop, think, and make a good decision, as she put it? No. So again, if you want to talk about back to basics, okay, but what does it take to succeed at those basics? And that's where social and emotional learning is critical, is foundational. It's there's another kind of cutesy phrase that one of our board members uses, which is all learning is social and emotional. It is. And if you're right, you need to be able to be social and have relationships with your teacher and your classmates, and you have emotions. You just do, and you cannot separate math and reading from that. So this back to basics thing is real. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's such a key part of the pushback, and it is just flawed, in terms of the way it's being applied. But I think the pandemic context of what you just mentioned is a huge part of it. And it also exposed kids' social and emotional needs, and it gave parents a window into what those needs were. So in some ways, it's also surprising, because it would make me think that you'd want to have those addressed. However, I should say, and I'd be remiss if I don't say, that yes, we're hearing all this pushback. However, when we look at survey data, it's overwhelmingly in support of SEL from parents. It's something like 88% of parents want their kids to get social and emotional learning in schools. Teachers want it. Students want it. It's like nothing, it's like 80% and above for all those groups. So yes, we're hearing all this pushback post-pandemic, and it's surprising. On the other hand, is the pushback really the majority of voices? No, not at all. The public perception on SEL is very strong.
Okay, that's good to know.
It is confusing, but the loudest voices are the ones that are critical.
Yeah, for sure. And how would you say that, stakeholders are pushing back against the pushback? You mentioned that we have the testimonies, right? We have students coming to testify that please don't ban SEL. It's really helping me in my school and learning. But are there any other ways that people are pushing back, or that they can push back if they want to?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think there are several things we've seen, and I've mentioned a few of them kind of just throughout our conversation. But one of them is that we've seen kind of a pendulum swing here of local school board elections, which is critical, right? I've been talking a lot about state and federal elections, which are fun and exciting and sexy, but where the rubber meets the road is local. So there was a handful of local school board elections that really during the height of the pandemic, I think, swung towards people who were anti-masking and anti-SEL and anti-DEI, anti-CRT, all these things. We started to see that pendulum swing back. So school boards they're starting to lose seats. So I think one of the ways we've seen that pushback is electorally at the local level. People who are pushing back on that rhetoric. and are winning those elections on that basis. So we've seen that this is just a losing issue more and more. I think voters are getting tired of it, are getting tired of hearing things, some of these criticisms we've heard, and all, and the just being anti everything, anti books, right? Book banning, stuff like that. So those school board candidates are starting to lose. So that's one of the ways that folks are starting to resist that, is by getting candidates back into school boards who are making decisions, and getting social and emotional, protecting social and emotional learning in the time that it deserves. One other way that I mentioned earlier is kind of this weathering the storm approach, which is to hide the work, to be honest, under another name. So we talked about that a fair amount. I won't beat that one too much more, but just calling it something else, and continuing the work that we know is right for children. And hopefully someday we can come back out from under that rock. But if not, as long as the kids are getting what they need, I don't think anyone at CASEL or myself is gonna throw up a huge fit over that. I think there's another approach that's kind of sticking to the science and the research and evidence, and just pumping it out in ways that are digestible. So one of the ways that that's being done is, it's through communications, it's through social media, it's through op-eds and are getting articles put out there that are refuting these criticisms. It's through there's now a coalition called the Leading with SEL Coalition that's made up of 20 or 30 national organizations that are all with one voice speaking about the evidence and science and research and benefits of social emotional learning. Another really fascinating one that I think is newer, but it will be interesting to pay attention to in the coming years, because of all these bans that we've seen over the past several years, and all these restrictions on SEL and things of that, and DEI, to be honest, and equity work. There's some school districts and folks in school districts, teachers and educators and parents, who are bringing civil rights complaints to the Office of Civil Rights, and the Department of Justice, at the federal level, and showing and pointing to the ways in which restricting students' access to those things, like SEL, is actually a violation of students' civil rights and right to a high quality education. So that's another way that that there's that kind of legal lever that people are pulling as well. And then there's the legislative fight at the state level that we've seen, which is really kind of one of the more exciting ones, where we get to see all these people show up and speak to the value of it. We've seen spectacular fails of bills in places from Iowa to New Hampshire to Montana to North Dakota, places where people have just come out. My favorite one, and I'll be brief, is in Montana last year. There was a legislator who brought forth a bill to ban social and emotional learning. Something like 30 people showed up in person to testify against that bill. The legislator then came back up after all the testimony and said something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing, "I'm so sorry, I didn't understand what this was, and I'm grateful to have heard from all these teachers and educators about what it actually is, and I apologize for bringing forth this bill." And then she withdrew the bill. And so that, it shows to some degree that just the extent of misinformation that's out there. And when we get these voices out there, and that's where I'd really encourage people to just pay attention to that. If you live in a state or in a place that this pushback is going on, your voice matters. People need to hear from you and understand what's actually going on, because, and this is our fault to some degree, it's been poorly communicated over the many years what SEL actually is and is not. So we need to be better about it and make sure that legislators and people making decisions on our behalf actually understand what it is.
Wow, that's a powerful example that she came back and said, wait, now that I've heard you, I really understand this, and I support it. I don't know why I put this bill forward. That's great.
She demonstrated some social and emotional skill there to be able to have some understanding and some good listening skills and some awareness, some self-awareness at long last. So it was really powerful. And I think that it's something that I hope we can continue to see. I hope that example, actually, now that I think about it, I hope that's what we see the country do as a whole eventually, is to say, whoops, sorry, we didn't realize what this actually was. Our bad. Like, we shouldn't have wrapped it up in this. I don't really expect Chris Rufo to do that ever, but and I should say that, God forbid, if Trump does win another term, SEL is going to be under attack in a whole other way. It just will. So so that is a concern. But I on the other hand, I do think that there is some fatigue about people pushing back on this, and some growing realization that this is something that's needed and necessary, and that these are valuable skills for people to have.
Thank you. And I want to kind of close out the podcast with, I've asked my other guests, what are you excited about in the future for education? Maybe it's about SEL, but maybe it's not. Just something that makes you feel hopeful and something that makes you feel like, wow, we're going in a really good direction. I feel excited about this. Is there anything that you feel excited about for the education sector?
Yeah, for sure. I think, well, for SEL, I'll start there and then go from there with maybe something else. But I think that I'm really pleased in the way, because of those concerns that we've discussed about academics and clearly needing to show people the benefits academically. There's a lot of more intentional research starting, being embarked on to point to the specific ways in which, be more specific and intentional about, okay, well, how does this SEL policy or this approach impact this outcome for these people, right? And for which people? And to be able to do that is really going to be the gold standard, I think, for going forward, for us to be able to say to people, not just that there's, broad stroke benefits here, but that we can say, no, we know exactly how this works, why it works, and for who. I think that's really exciting. So there's more research kind of underway around that. I think there's been a recognition again in the field to have that continuous learning and grow in that area. I think the other piece that I'm excited about and nervous about and worried about all at the same time is the ways in which and where I think I'm really interested in learning more over the years to come is how is the implementation level of policies. And this is another thing that we're actually starting to study, which is exciting. But sure, you can have a policy that, one of my great interests is restorative practices in schools. So you can have a policy encouraging and requiring even that schools have alternative forms of discipline and get rid of zero tolerance policies at the state level and all sorts of things like that. But if you're not, we know that if you're not implementing it well or with fidelity or in a culturally responsive way, it can really not only not work, but can backfire in some cases. So I'm excited to think more over the years about how does policy listen to people on the ground more to make policies more responsive, and then also just to think about, and then excited and nervous to think about what are the limitations of policymakers, right? I think there are some, and I think sometimes there's some hubris around that, around what we can and can't, what we can do. So excited to think more about, what the limitations are. I know this doesn't sound exciting, but what are the limitations of policymakers, and how do we make sure that we're handing off the baton to people on the ground to do the work that matters in a way that's effective?
Thank you so much. And I also wanted to say thank you for being on this podcast. Thank you so much for your expertise and your growing expertise in this area. And you mentioned at the end the restorative practices, which I feel like is a whole other podcast episode that we could totally talk about. Sure. Restorative justice. Yeah.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. Well, Victoria, I can't thank you enough, and I think it's great that you're doing this. And it's already been exciting to listen to a few episodes so far, and I'm grateful for you lifting up important issues like social and emotional learning and international education, and on and on and on. And
thank you. Okay, we'll close out there, and thank you so much for listening. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you next time. Bye.